weeks before, but obviously it wasn't. You gotta start. Okay, gotta start.
Greg, my clock's a minute off, so I'm going live right now, so you can start whenever you're ready.
Okay, I've got 31 seconds on my clock,
All good.
so. And Steve gives me a thumbs up on the timekeeping. I should work for NASA. Hi, Phil. Hi, Jack. How are you?
Hi, Phil.
Good, glad to see you.
You too. All right, we'll get started in just a few moments.
Not a lot of people.
Yeah. Today is,
How many days? Counting Yoma.
it's an auspicious day on the calendar. Good afternoon. It's Yom HaAtzmaut. It is also May 14th, and this was one of those interesting years where Yom HaAtzmaut and May 14th fall on the same day. But today, of course, is the anniversary of the birth of the state of Israel. 76 years ago today, David Ben-Gurion stood up in Independence Hall and declared the state. There was a beautiful program last night at the Federation, mostly focusing on Yom HaZikaron and the memories of the 25,000 plus who have given their lives to the state of Israel over its 76 years of history. Some who have given them in service, some who have been the victims of terror. We called upon those who passed on or after October 7th, but also look forward to what, God willing this year will bring, which is a renewed sense of peace and stability for the states, and for the Jewish people around the world. We certainly hold all of Israel, and it was fun last night. There's probably 250 people in Zinman Hall, and at one point they asked everyone who has friends or relatives who live in Israel to please rise. It was everybody. Who's going to? Everyone who's going to Yom HaAtzmaut celebration has people who are in Israel. But it was a lovely celebration. Today, we're going to pick up from where we left off last week. I had intended to learn much of what we're going to learn today last week, but as things go, conversations often take more time than expected. But just as a quick review, for those of you who were not with us last week, we're talking about this new collection called Dirshuni, Contemporary Women's Voice Midrashim. These are midrashim that have been written by a variety of women in Israel who come from a variety of religious backgrounds. By that, I mean within the Jewish community, but some are religious, some are secular, some are to the right politically, some are to the left politically. But their motivation is to do a few things, right? Remember that Midrash is a way for us to deepen our understanding of the biblical text. Traditional Midrashim come from the period between, I would say, 1200 to 1700 years ago. And they are, the tools of the Midrashist are using biblical verse, are expressing a particular theological or educational message, and are often about taking the verses apart and putting them back together to create new ideas, right? If you think about Legos, for example, you can take a Lego set and you can take it apart, and you can also make it look bigger or taller, this and the other. And there's a sense of word play and of sentence play and of meaning play and of theology play that is going on with the idea of midrashim, right? And we looked at this one example where in the book of Genesis, when God is wondering aloud where Adam has gone, God says to Adam, Ayeka, where are you? And of course, what a ridiculous question for God to ask, because how could it possibly be that God wouldn't know where Adam was? That it was a rhetorical question, that God wasn't so much asking Ayeka, and remove hang on a second. Sorry, I'm playing with the pictures of those of you at home on the screen, which is blocking what I wanted to show. Another word in Hebrew that has the exact same four consonants is Eicha, how, the beginning of the book of Lamentations, how could this have happened, right? And so the rabbis would say, well, when God really says Ayeka, God was wanting us to think of the idea of Eicha at the same time and infusing this understanding into the text as it exists. Doesn't change the texts, but just complicates and nuances our understanding of it, okay? So the Dirshuni project is coming from the position, and I think you have to sort of grant this in order to really engage with this, that the biblical text comes from holding aside the biblical text for 1 second and the question of its authorship and whether or not its author has a gender identity, we can just put that to the side for 1 second. But certainly the midrashim, the rabbinic voices talking about the biblical text, have a gender identity, right? The male rabbis of the ancient Near Eastern period, okay? And so throughout both the biblical text and the midrashic texts, there is the presence of an absence, the absence of the female perspective. And that is the perspective of the female participants in the stories, as well as the sort of unnamed feminine perspective of the community. We mentioned last week, for example, that one of the goals of the midrashim was to read into the biblical text the contemporary mores of the community. The rabbis were understanding the biblical text through their worldview that was 1,000 years after the biblical text. We are reading those same biblical texts nearly 2,000 years after that. And there are mores that we would read into the biblical text if we were writing midrashim today, which is what the authors of Dirshuni are doing. And they're doing it from a particular lens, which is wanting to respond to the absence of female characters, the absence of the voices of the existing female characters, and the absence of the presumptions of what some might call a stereotypical feminine outlook that are well known in society but don't appear in the biblical text, right? What does that mean? The idea that there's a difference in parenting between mothers and fathers, right, is an example of that, right? We may agree or disagree that men and women parent the same, but we can all agree that stereotypically mothers relate to their children in ways that are different from the way that their fathers relate to their children. And there's very little in the biblical text about being a mother. There's also very little about being a father for that sake, but not because there's a lack of opportunity, because frankly, the rabbis don't think very much about being fathers because they don't do a lot of parenting. They do a lot of studying. But we're going to see today a series of examples where the relationship between mothers and their children are left unspoken in the biblical text. And what opportunity was there for a father-son relationship or a father-son relationship was a missed opportunity. Okay? So these are some of the things. The other thing that Dirshuni often focuses on is the role of the other. If you want to grant for the moment that Judaism is a historically patriarchal society, and I think that that's a fair presumption, a patriarchal society has an eternal other within it. Who is the eternal other in a patriarchal society?
Patriarchs.
The matriarchs, women, right? In a patriarchal society, men by default have the power of perspective. And so the perspective of the woman is the outsider's perspective. The male perspective is the normalized one, and the other perspective is somehow novel. And so if you have members of the patriarchy commenting on a patriarchal system and a patriarchal society, you're going to have the whole gamut of female perspectives as the eternal other, but cracking the door into opening up your mind to, oh, there's another perspective, meaning the women's perspective, also cracks the door for the perspective of other others as well. Because there are other others in the text. There is the foreigner. There is the impoverished person. There is the widow or the orphan, who also is the other in a variety of biblical texts, and whose perspectives are also not particularly frequently attended to, be they male or female, for that matter. Okay? You with me?
Yes.
Yes? Okay. All right. So we had looked at the story last week. I'm not going to review again the story of Lot's wife, right? Who the story, as we know, Lot was told you need to leave Sodom and Gomorrah. You have to leave with some of your daughters and leave others there. And you may not turn back and look. And if you do, you're going to turn to a pillar of salt. Lot's wife, in the biblical text, turns back, turns to salt, and is castigated by the tradition for essentially being unable to tear herself away from the emotional sinfulness of Sodom and Gomorrah and turning around. And in the Midrash by Rudy Timur, we saw that, wait a minute. It's never clear in the biblical text that Lot's wife was given the instruction not to look back. She was looking back maybe because she was enticed by the sinfulness of Sodom and Gomorrah, or maybe because she had two daughters who she was leaving behind for certain death. And that she turned into salt, not because of like an instantaneous of being punished, but because the tears that she was shedding overwhelmed her and turned her into salt. Right? There is an example of adding into what is the absence, right? It's not contravening the biblical text, right? If the biblical text had said, and God said to Lot's wife, don't turn around, and they offer this midrash, it would have contravened the biblical text. But the beauty of this midrash is it recognizes that there was a gap in the biblical text. The biblical text says that God spoke to Lot. There is no record of anyone speaking to Lot's wife. There was the plausible deniability that Lot's wife knew what would have happened if she had looked back. And that gives us a reason to say, maybe she's not guilty. Maybe she didn't do anything wrong.
So why did that come up like that?
Say that again.
So therefore, we already negated her or like criticized her for something she may not have known.
Right.
But that's what has always come through on these tests.
That's the point. I mean, the point of this collection is to point this out exactly. That over and over and over again,
So
women in particular are held to account, held to standards, their perspectives are discarded. Not all of them are about reclaiming the innocence of a negative person, right? I mean, Lot's wife is held as a guilty person in our tradition. This particular midrash is there maybe to cast doubt on that perspective. The women that we're going to look at today are not women who are seen as being guilty in the same way, as much as they're seen as other things. What do I mean by that? All right. Here's Lot's wife. Okay. Sarah's trials. Who is known to have had trials in the biblical text? I'll give you a clue, there were 10 of them. There was someone who was known to have had 10 trials.
Job.
Job had some trials, but not necessarily 10. All right, well,
Sarah.
the answer is, well, Sarah doesn't list it as having had 10 trials, but her husband Abraham is, right? And we look at the text. According to Pirkei Avot, chapter 5, verse 3, 10 times was Abraham our father put to the test, and he withstood them all. This tells us how great was the love of our father Abraham. Okay? What were some of the tests? Anyone know offhand what some of the tests of Abraham were?
Her husband had a child with a maid servant.
No, we're talking about Abraham. What were Abraham's tests? There was the barrenness, there was the going to Egypt, there was the Sodom and Gomorrah and the arguing with God, there was all some of the same things. But now we're going to see, again, in the absence of a record of what Sarah's life was like, right? Abraham gets all kinds of credit for the tests that God put him through. We don't think that Sarah also endured tests in those processes. 10 times was Sarah, our mother, put to the test. Apologies for the typo. And she withstood them all. This tells how strong she was and how great was her hope. That she was barren and without a child, test number 1. Test number 2, she was taken from her birthplace and her father's home to an unknown land. What does that mean?
she moved with her husband.
Yeah, she wakes up one morning and her husband says,
We're gone.
"We are going." Doesn't ask her. He says, "We are going." And she goes. And by the way, why is that so dangerous? Why is that so terrible?
Because she's a stranger.
She's a stranger. So is Abraham. So is Abraham. Why is it more dangerous for a woman to leave her homeland than her husband?
Backup,
Say more.
no more backup.
No more backup. What is it
From
from?
family, backup, nothing, go to a strange place.
Yeah,
Yeah, you've lost all your power connections.
right. In this patriarchal society, women rely on the protection of a man. When you're a child and a young maiden, who offers you your protection? Your father. And if he should pass away, your brother or your brothers. Up to and until you marry. And then you are your husband's responsibility to keep you safe. Now, let's think for a moment about the story of Ruth and Naomi. Okay? And Orpah. So Naomi travels to Moab. Right? Marries, has sons. Her Israelite sons marry Moabite women. And what happens to her husband and her sons? They all die, right? So what is Naomi's instinct at the moment in a foreign land? She's without the protection of her husband or her sons. To go back to the land of her parentage, because that will offer protection. So the moment that Abraham says to Sarah, we are leaving home, in the short term, she's safe. But what should she be worried about? And what long term could happen?
Anything.
Abraham could die. And then she is now away from the protection of her homeland and her family and without a man to look for her. That is the concern. She was taken from her birthplace and her father's home to an unknown land, where she became more precarious because now she had only one man to rely on, as opposed to, as Dave said, having been. She was asked to lie on Abraham's behalf on coming to Egypt and being taken to Pharaoh's home, where there was done to her what was done to her. What was done to her?
She said she was Abraham's sister, so Pharaoh took her,
Right.
took her.
So Anita says that she was asked to lie to say that she was Abraham's sister. Anita, why did she do that? You remember? No. So Abraham and Sarah end up in Egypt as a married couple. This feeds right into the thing before. Abraham is worried that you now have this foreign couple without any protection entering into Pharaoh's power. What could Pharaoh very easily do? Kill who? Abraham. And do what? Take Sarah as a wife. Right? So Abraham says, I know a way to prevent it. Because a husband has no way to prevent Pharaoh from doing it. But Pharaoh's sense of honor would prevent him from doing that to her brother. As her brother, he would pay me a dowry, a bride price, to take my sister to be my wife. So Abraham tells Sarah to lie and say that she is his sister. Pharaoh pays Abraham a bride price and takes Sarah as a wife. Abraham has forced Sarah.
Abraham has what?
Forced Sarah into either infidelity or polyamory or prostitution,
All of the above.
for which she is celebrated
Interesting.
and rewarded. And Sarah is forced into marriage to someone she doesn't want to be married with. And what is done to her is what is done to her, which is a euphemism for rape. They survive that. Her Egyptian maidservant then bears a child for Abraham, her man. Right? This is Hagar. Right? Maidservants is a word that gets thrown around a lot. Another word for maidservant is handmaid, handmaiden. If you have read The Handmaid's Tale, what is the job of a handmaid?
To bear a child.
To bear a child on behalf of somebody, exactly. Right, that is Hagar's job. Hagar's job is to give Abraham a son because Sarah cannot. But the idea of a handmaiden is a patriarchal idea. That a man deserves to have children, irrespective of how he achieves that. And the needs of the wife and the needs of the handmaiden are secondary. So Sarah was asked to withstand that trial. Then her maidservant makes light of her. That may be a typo also.
That's the type.
Yeah, but she makes fun of her. Ha ha ha, I can have his child and you can't. Then, when she's angry and she's acting out, and she's being acted out at by Hagar, she feels aggrieved by Hagar. To whom does she turn?
Abraham.
Abraham. And she says, Abraham, my husband, your handmaiden is mistreating me. And what does he say to her? Do what you see fit. You take care of it. Rather than stand up for her and protect her and defend her, he makes her do the dirty work. Then she heard from the opening of the tent the news of Isaac's birth. That she waited for many years her husband Abraham to return from his journey and his wars. And then she was asked to lie again on Abraham's behalf on the coming of Gerar and being taken to Abimelech's home, where she was done to her. The same thing that happened in Egypt happened to her again. And then what's the kicker?
Son was taken.
Her son was taken to be sacrificed, Isaac. Now, all of these episodes appear in the biblical text. There are a few moments where Sarah's voice is heard, like in Genesis 16. But even in the moment where her voice is heard, how is it treated? It's dismissed. You do what you need to do. Talk about how lonely she must have been throughout her life. Taken away from her father's home, her birthplace home. Given over to Pharaoh as a wife she didn't want to be. Having to watch her husband father a child with another woman. Have that woman make fun of her. Have her concerns be dismissed by her husband. Not being fully aware of the birth of her son Isaac. Having to be lonely while her husband was off fighting his wars. With Hagar, maybe. With Isaac alone. Again with the prostitution. And then seeing her son, the one thing she always wanted. The child of her 90th year. Being taken to sacrifice. You think Abraham passed tests? Again, all of this is in the biblical text. They didn't, these midrashim did not add any of this. They just shone a light into a dark place in the text where it wasn't talked about. And said, what about Sarah in this moment? Reflections, wonderings, observations.
A hard life.
What's that?
It was a hard life.
It was a hard life.
I think in general, life was hard for women until after the Second World War. And still today, among the more religious people of all religions, women are still treated as chattel.
In some communities, women are treated as chattel for sure. But I'm gonna push you even farther to say, even in most striving to be egalitarian communities, even here in our community, if we're being honest with ourselves, when you look at sociologic studies of the way that labor is divided in a household, it's not divided.
It's not,
That women's work is still women's work and thought of as such. But the difference is now that most couples who are my contemporaries who I know, both parents are working, most of them full-time. And in many of them, and this is the projection that both in the couple are working full-time, and the women tend to be carrying more of the burden of the household responsibilities, right? And if it's not only the physical load, but there's this idea of mental load. Has anyone heard of the phrase mental load? Right?
No.
It might be that dad is running carpool and picking up the kids where they need to go, but mom is the one who knows who has to be where. And reminding him it's time to go get your pickup, like the mental, the keeping it all straight in their head is a task unto itself. And there's that piece of it as well. It is better, but it's not better.
some cases these days. And only a few, that is not true.
Yeah.
I know of two instances.
Sure.
Where dads are the full-time caregivers.
For sure. For sure.
And mom is working,
I'm speaking in the aggregate,
yes.
right? In the aggregate, if you had to look at what the sort of typical millennial parenting structure, it's two-parent working couples. And the women take on more of the house working duty in addition to their work.
Mhm.
Right? And it's a different mix than before, but it's still there. Right? The really interesting test case, by the way, to know how this breaks down is you look at same-sex couples.
Say it again.
Same-sex couples, right? In the way that they divide the work. And it's a whole other, but that's a whole conversation for a different day.
But I grew up where I listened to my father and then I listened to my husband.
Different generation. Right? That was still a very patriarchal. Did your mother work?
No.
Right. Right?
Neither did I until I.
So there's, there were, in the generations in the 20th century, right? It obviously was not nearly as patriarchal as this, right? Your mother was not your father's chattel. However, it was clear to her from the moment of her birth what her life was probably going to look like. And the opportunities to work were not there for her. And in the home, the father's word was the word. Right? That has begun to change. Right? We teach our young girls today, you can do and be whatever it is you want to be. In ways that your mother, maybe even you were not given that opportunity. But the presumption still, listen. A husband and a wife decide to have a child. The presumption is, how is mom going to change her work schedule to meet the child's needs?
Not the father.
Not
But how the mother.
Right. That's changing. And these are questions that I raise with couples before they're even getting married to think about this. And there are couples that do like Anita said, which is actually they make the decision that the right thing for the family is for dad to change his work as opposed to mom. But those are the exceptions that prove the rule. And they're happening more and more and more frequently, but it's still there. Right? Not to mention, and I gotta be honest, there's a lot of things that reinforce this. I'm a public school parent. You think the public school thinks to call me before my wife? Never. No, they just don't. They just presume. Right? And by the way, the public school system is still presumed that there's a parent who's not working.
That's presumptuous. Can I just one thing?
School's at 2:00.
When I make phone calls from the temple, and it has a husband and wife phone number,
Mm-hmm.
I have the tendency to call the woman's phone number and not the man's.
And I don't. I call the first, whichever one is listed as the first contact.
No, I don't.
Right.
Why?
Why not?
Because I'd rather disturb or.
You're making-
Oh, you presume that he's working and she's not.
Yeah.
I know she's working, but I feel like I can easier relate,
That's different.
or just. Whatever it is, I
Yeah.
will be more of a tendency.
Yeah.
To call the wife.
Right.
Of the two phone numbers that are given to me.
My goal is not to tell you what's right or wrong, it's just to point out how we think about these
Sure.
things.
Yeah, I'm just saying,
Maybe you need to rethink what you're doing.
Maybe?
Maybe you need to rethink what you're doing.
All right.
That's why I'm saying what I'm saying.
We are gonna move forward. You can take this home with you for homework. No, that's it. It's
We'll
you.
talk about this.
Sarah and the sacrifice of Isaac. Okay, so this is specifically about the story of the binding of Isaac. And it came to pass after those matters. Vayihi achar hadabrim ha'ela, right? That's how the chapter 22 begins. After these things. Those matters, the matters with Sarah. And God tested Sarah. And the angel said to her, take your son, your only one, whom you have loved, Isaac, and take him to the land of Moriah and offer him up. And Sarah said, no, because a mother does not slaughter her child. And early in the morning, Sarah awoke, stunned to see that neither Isaac nor Abraham was there. She lifted her arms to God in heaven and said, Master of the universe, I know that one who slaughters his son in the name of God will in the end be left without a son or God. Forgive Abraham, who was mistaken about this. Please remember that it did not occur to a mother to offer her son up to God and save the boy from him. At that moment, Abraham stretched out his hand to the knife to slay his son. And the angel of God called out to him and said, do not lay your hand on the boy and do not do anything to him, for now I know that you are God-fearing, even though you did not withhold your son. And this is why it was said, whatever Sarah tells you, heed her voice. And as a result, for in Isaac your seed will have a name.
I love that. Wow.
So a few things that are going on here that I want to point out. In the story of the binding of Isaac, Sarah's voice is completely absent. Whether or not Abraham talked about it with her, we don't know. There's no record. What this midrash does is it gives Sarah a voice, and it suggests that before telling Abraham to sacrifice his son, God first reached down to Sarah and asked her to sacrifice her son.
What would you think?
Why would I think?
Yeah, right, I mean,
We're imagining.
well, no, the reality is, who would think, as a mother, take your son and sacrifice him?
Wouldn't that have been a more compelling act of theologic commitment than a father? Why? We just talked about not calling the husband first or not calling the wife first. Why do we presume that God only talked to Abraham? Why do we presume that's the first phone call?
Psychologically more able.
Patriarchally, that's why.
Yeah.
I'm naming them, I'm not picking on them, I'm naming this. No, like, this is exactly the kind of presumption that this midrash is meant to surface so we can dismiss. Why should it be that only Abraham gets the call? Why can't we imagine that God went to Sarah? And by the way, there's a textual reason to suggest that there was a conversation before God spoke to Abraham.
With Sarah.
Well, with somebody, because the verse begins, or the chapter begins, Vayihi achar hadavarim ha'ela. It was after these things, or it was after these words, which is what the word devarim actually means. And so what the Midrash is answering is, why does the story begin and it took place after these things or after these words? What were those things? What were those words? What it was after was the conversation between God and Sarah. God first, in between the end of chapter 21 and the beginning of chapter 22, which is when a lot of the midrashim take place, there was an unrecorded conversation between between God and Sarah. Where God told Sarah, take your son, your only son, who you love, and sacrifice him.
But she said no.
And she said no. And after that conversation, after those words, then we get what we get in chapter 22. Right? So part of the Midrash is responding to the curiosity of the opening of chapter 22. Because it alludes to an undescribed, uncertain utterances or speaking or things. Something happened that is undescribed in Torah. And that gives the Midrashist entree to wonder what might that thing have been. And their answer in this case, Rivka Lubitch's answer is a conversation between God and Sarah. Right? Because if we think for a moment that asking a father to sacrifice his son would be an indication of his commitments, how much more the more so if it was the mother?
So this is codifying what we do when we take a Torah, when we take a verse of Torah and we discuss it in, let's say, Torah study, or if it's a holiday and we're having a night study class and we take a portion, and this is the one we take all the time on Rosh Hashanah.
Yep.
And yet, I think I've still pulled this thing 50 times in my life and never thought, why is the voice of Sarah missing?
So the only thing I'm gonna offer a correction to what you said, Nita, was the word codifying. Right?
Okay.
Because the word codifying suggests that it makes it authoritative. And the beautiful thing about midrashim in general is they're all authoritative and none of them are authoritative. Right? None of the midrashim are, this is the way you have to understand what happened. Right? I mentioned this last week, that in some books of midrashim, you may have the rabbis offering 3 and 4 or 5 midrashim on the same verse that are actually mutually exclusive. They can't both be true at the same time. But they're both valid ways to understand what the text might mean. Right? Midrashim suggests what the text might mean. And they do that based on the perspective of the author in their time. Right? So it took until 2022, although not really. There are other examples of the story of the binding of Isaac, for example. Rivka Lubitch is not the first person to wonder what was Sarah thinking. There are some beautiful examples of Israeli poetry that explore that. I'm taking the kids to school today. I decided on Yom Ha'atzmaut to put on some Israeli music, and we're in the car, and I just searched for Naomi Shemer, who wrote Yerushalayim Shel Zahav and Al Kol Eila. And so I just put on Amazon Music, and unbeknownst to me, she has a song called Akedat Yitzchak, The Binding of Isaac, which basically says that as Abraham was taking him up the mountain starts to cry out, the mountains interject, the mountains say, we should, here's this thing and another thing. And so it's a reframing of the story of what happened, but it doesn't situate it specifically in the place of Sarah. There are others that do. And, we could have a litany of things that Sarah might have thought and said. And Rivka Lubitch puts words to one. Right? But what's beautiful and brilliant about this is she doesn't just say, if I was Sarah, what would I have thought? Which is what they could have done. She does the thing that traditional midrashim do, which is she uses the text to scaffold her midrash. She uses the enigmatic opening, it was after these things. Because the midrash says, the idea of midrash is that there's no extraneous letter, no extraneous word anywhere in Torah. So if it says, and it was after these things, the presumption is the authors of Torah want us to be thinking of something with these things. It's not just fluff. It's not just filler, because there is no filler. Every word has a specific meaning. So what might have it been? It could have been this. Linda, please. You have to unmute if you want to
I
share.
just, yeah, I was doing the wrong way. Anyway, so what year did these women decide to get together and come up with these different ways to fill in the blanks?
So it's a great question. This collection was published in 2022.
And do you have any idea, like,
And they're
when
still
they-
doing more, by the way. Like, this is the first
Right.
volume. They're still publishing more. They were published in Hebrew, and they're working on getting them translated into English as well.
And so they've been working on it for how long before they got it published? And how did this group of women even come together? Do you know any of that?
I'm gonna have to read the introduction more deeply, because there are, there are a few dozen women who contribute to this.
It's
Yeah. So but these are all Israeli women who are in sort of the world of biblical scholarship in various ways in Israel. Right? They teach, some of them teach at universities, some of them teach in more religious environments, they write journal articles, like these are women who know what they're talking about. And I say that because I gotta be honest, in our movements, in our community, there are other collections of midrashim that have been written by women, and they're really important and really insightful. But they tend to start, they tend to sort of start from wanting to superimpose a feminist perspective into the tradition, which is necessary. But there's something about these women who are wholly committed to Midrash as a genre, and the structure and the historical groundedness, and like wanting to be faithful to all the different trappings of the genre while introducing new perspectives. It is a little bit of a critique of what have come from the 70s and 80s and 90s, mostly in the States, which are wanting to add the feminist perspective, but aren't committed to the genre of midrashim in the same way. Not to mention, they're doing it in Israel, right? So they get to do it in Hebrew in ways that is, in some ways, let's be honest, it's a little more authentic, because they're doing the Hebrew wordplay that just falls out in translation. Right? Because only in Hebrew can you get the fact that Genesis 22:1, Vayhi achar hadavarim ha'eleh, and it was after these devarim. Can you get the wordplay of the word devarim? Right? Because devarim can mean things, it can mean happenings, it can mean utterances, it can mean words. That only plays out in Hebrew. If you're doing it in translation to English, you have to choose which understanding of the word devarim are you going to use. And if you look at the story, if you look at Genesis 21-22 and just the biblical text, words is the least likely thing that you're going to use. If we open up our Chumash, it's going to be after these things, right? Genesis 21 is a story of Sarah and Hagar and the sending off of Hagar. Events are the most likely thing that Genesis 22:1 are referring to if we're seeing it as simply a transitionary clause to get us from one chapter into the next. Only the midrashis would say there's no such thing as only a transitionary statement. The word devarim has a specific meaning here. And we have to understand this chapter first by saying, what was it that word refers to? And in this case, the midrashis is offering an understanding that the word devarim refers to words that were spoken between God and Sarah.
So when's the first time a woman is actually notated as having said something?
That's a great question. I would want to go back. I mean, probably Eve.
When she wanted that apple.
I mean, I'm gonna say this speaks to the patriarchy, right? Which is, yes, there is back and forth between Adam and Eve.
Uh-huh.
Here, Genesis chapter 3, Ha'isha el hanachash, and the woman spoke to the serpents. That's in Genesis 3. In Genesis 2, right, we have the creation of this second human being. And let's see, God says to the human, and they were naked, right? So there's no speaking done by the female human in Genesis chapter 2. Genesis chapter 3. The serpent was the shrewdest of all the wild beasts that God had made. It said to the woman, did God really say, you shall not eat from any tree of the garden? Right? And of course the answer is, well, if God did, just like the story of Lot and Lot's wife, the instruction that God gave to Adam, the human, for not eating from the tree of knowledge of good and evil was spoken to Adam before Eve was even created. The text presumes that Adam told Eve that she wasn't supposed to. The serpent knows to presume that Adam said to Eve. And then the serpent says, did God really say that? And then, the woman says, we may eat of the fruit of the other trees of the garden. We pre-ate asher b'toch hagan amar Elohim lo tochunu. It is only of the fruit of the tree in the middle of the garden that God said, you shall not eat of it or touch it lest you die. And of course, the touching thing God didn't say either. There are some midrashim here, by the way, about this story as well. I chose to focus in the first few weeks on motherhood because we're surrounding Mother's Day.
Thank you.
Sure. I got more.
Stay tuned.
No, we're not done. Right? So if we grant the premise of the Midrash, God spoke to Sarah. Sarah said, over my dead body. And so the God went to Abraham. And Abraham did without asking. Sarah wakes up one morning, her husband and her son are gone. And so she can't do it. And then what it concludes to is this notion that it is impossible to break your parental responsibility in the service of God. It is not that God would never ask this of us. It's this more beautiful thing. It's that parental responsibility and parental love is service to God. We don't serve God with words of prayer, although we do. And we don't serve God with acts of sacrifice, although we do. You want to write a sermon for the morning of Rosh Hashanah about what the Akedah is meant to teach us? It's that the way we show our loyalty to God is by being the parents that we're supposed to be, by being the friends that we're supposed to be, by being the neighbors that we're supposed to be, by being the stranger that we're supposed to be, by being the enemy that we're supposed to be. All of those relationships come with expectations. How to be a parent, how to be a child, how to be a neighbor, be a friend, be a stranger, be an enemy. We have expectations on how to do all those things. What do we call those expectations? We call them mitzvot. The Torah tells us how to be a parent, how to be a child, how to be a neighbor, how to be a community member, how to be a stranger, how to be an enemy. All of those relationships have certain things that are laid out in Torah called mitzvot. How do we serve God? By doing the mitzvot. Abandoning your parental responsibility, abdicating your parental responsibility is an abdication of your service to God. That is the message that Sarah wants us to learn in the Midrash. You can't sacrifice your child in service to God. It is an internal conflict. If you do it, you have negated your service to God. And whose wisdom ought we listen to?
Wisdom of the mother.
The wisdom of Sarah. Whatever Sarah tells you, heed her voice. It tells us in the previous chapter. Here's another beautiful example of the Midrash just using the methodologies of Midrash. In Midrash, it doesn't matter whether a teaching or an expression comes earlier or later in the Torah. There's no chronology that matters. Right? So the fact that the instructions are based in chapter 21, or the conclusion is based in chapter 21, that we should read chapter 21 teaching us lesson in 22, doesn't matter. It's all valid. The chronology has no impact whatsoever. It's a fun game to like to play. We have time for one more. This is one that I printed for today. 3, 4, 5. We make it partway through this. It says in Pirkei Avot, let your house be open wide. A lovely teaching about welcoming the stranger, welcoming guests, hospitality, hachnasat orchim. Okay. So the title of this Midrash from Hagit Bar Tov, let your house be open wide. Ishmael, the son of a maidservant was he. Dan, Naphtali, Gad, and Asher, the sons of maidservants were they. All right. So we have here 5 sons of our patriarchs. One is Ishmael, who's the son of whom? Hagar and? Who's the father? Abraham. Okay. He was the son of a handmaid, of a maidservant. Dan, Naphtali, Gad, and Asher. Who are they? Sons of maidservants. And say it again, Steve.
Jacob's sons.
Yeah, there are some of Jacob's sons. They're some of the 12, right? How many wives did Jacob have?
4.
2. 2 wives. Right? Leah and Rachel were the 2 wives. And then there were 2 maidservants. And his 12 sons that he had were spread among the 4 women in various things. And Dan and Naphtali and Gad and Asher were born to the maidservants. So over 3 generations, right? Obviously the middle generation, Isaac did not have a maidservant. But between Abraham having Hagar and Jacob having Dan, Naphtali, Gad, and Asher, they had them be maidservants. Why did Ishmael despise Isaac? Now I'm reading from the Midrash. While Dan and Naphtali and Gad and Asher are sons of Israel and merited to inherit the land. Right? We're raising a bunch of questions here. On the one hand, the sons of Jacob who were born to maidservants were no more or no less, I'll use a loaded word, legitimate than Hagar and Ishmael, than Ishmael born to Hagar, right? Sons born to the patriarch via handmaiden.
So, the sons of the handmaiden,
Uh-huh,
did they have the same rights?
uh-huh.
As,
They got a portion of the land, they're part of the 12.
so they have the same rights as the legitimate sons. Wow.
So the sons of maidservants are not illegitimate. I use that word loadedly, right? Handmaidenship, maidservantship is not, it's not, well, the word I'm looking for, it's not infidelity. Right? These are considered to be part of the household. Legitimate sons of the father.
I wonder what the animosity is between the real sons and the handmaidens.
Well,
Here we go.
I know.
so we can play there. We know what happens between Isaac and Ishmael and Sarah and Hagar. And so here we're gonna play into, why is this, this is the Talmudic question, right? We have two scenarios over two generations that on paper look to be the same. Patriarch takes a handmaiden or two, has a son, has sons via the handmaiden. So the input seems to be the same. Why is the output so different? Because it is different, right? The way that the story of our tradition treats Ishmael and Hagar is so different than Dan and Naphtali and Asher and Gad and their handmaiden mothers. Okay, so here's the question. Why did Ishmael despise Isaac when Dan, Naphtali, Asher, and Gad merited to inherit the land? Okay, let's go back to the beginning. Sarah was barren.
It was because Hagar.
Let's not answer till we read the,
Okay.
yeah, we're gonna get there. Jack, do you have a clarifying question or an answer to the question?
Well, what I would just like to mention the fact that when you let a concubine go with the child, you have to go as Abraham did and supply them with food, etc. That was the way to depart them from your family.
Yes,
You can voluntarily keep them, but you can also buy them off essentially.
our responsibilities, yes. But this is getting to the question, why was Abraham inclined to send Ishmael and Hagar off, but Jacob not so, with Dan and Naphtali and Gad and Asher? That's the question that we're gonna explore. That's the question the Midrash is gonna ask. Sarah was barren. Rachel was barren. Of Sarah, it does not say that she was jealous. And it does not say, give me children or I shall die. Right? These are citations from Genesis chapter 30. Do you want to take a guess who did say those things? Rachel. Sarah's pain and hurt lay like a stone in her heart. And since she did not allow her anger to abate, there was no room left in her heart. Sarah said, if I do not merit a son from my loins, I will take a son not from my loins, and will be built through another woman. She took her maidservant and gave her to Abraham, her man, as his woman.
How magnanimous.
How magnanimous. But we're going to see actually how deeply problematic. The magnanimity of the maidservant, yes. But I'm going to foretell that the Midrash is going to hold Sarah responsible. This is a lesson I'm teaching my children. You are entitled to your feelings, however they come up. You're sad, you're angry, you're frustrated. You are entitled to feel however it is that you feel. And you are responsible for what you do with those feelings. The Midrash is going to hold Sarah responsible, not for having pain,
Because she gave up her.
but for not allowing her anger to abate, for not processing her pain. She didn't call a therapist. She held it inside, and she allowed her anger to continue to be played with and utilized over and over and over again. By the way, who should we be thinking about a stone in her heart?
Hagar.
Who?
Hagar, because Sarah does not treat her the way she's supposed to.
She's doing it towards Hagar. Any stone, hardness, anything recommend to think of anybody? Pharaoh, a hardened heart. Her heart, like a stone in her heart. She kept her anger. And so there was no room in her heart. Right? Why would if she's going to be magnanimous, she's going to be magnanimous. If you're going to be magnanimous, how should you feel when the maidservant you give to your husband bears a child?
Envy.
No.
No, you should feel happy.
No, if you're going to be magnanimous, you should feel happy. Right? You should be joyful that your family is now complete.
Yeah.
You should feel joyful that your husband feels the ability to be a father. There's this word called compersion. It's the opposite of jealousy. And if you wouldn't mind silencing, yeah, thank you.
Conversion.
Compersion. Comperson. It's the idea of the joy in your loved one getting joy that you're not providing. It's the opposite of jealousy.
Can I say one thing?
Sure,
I love the way you teach.
thank you.
You're welcome.
I'm not done yet.
Okay, but I just wanted, because I know you run out, so I just wanted to.
Thank you. We're gonna stop here because the next is line, but we got time for questions. Jack, go ahead.
Maybe Sarah was upset because Hagar let her know of her heart deficiency. I mean, she held it over Sarah that she had a son and Sarah had no one, which caused a feeling that Sarah just disliked her. At the time the others had children, that feeling was gone. What?
Who started it?
I think personally, I think Hagar started the problem. After
I
she,
would wanna look at context, but here's the thing, you might be right, but using this midrash as a jumping off point. Hagar, listen, I don't envy handmaidens. They have a very difficult emotional, relational line to walk, right? You're being brought into a marriage to provide for the family. It is fraught. It is fraught, right? This is not surrogacy like we have today, where a woman gives over her body for 10 months to provide a child to a couple who can conceive, knowing that child is going to be understood to be the child of those two parents completely, and the surrogate is not part of the parenting picture in the same way. But maidservants are the mother, but they're not the mother, they're not the wife, but they're there. It's this three-way responsibility. It's very complicated. So it might be, and I want to look at the text, Jack, to see that Hagar immediately held over Sarah her inability to conceive. But if we take this midrash to heart, from the moment that Hagar was brought into the picture, Sarah was angry at her for being the handmaiden that her husband needed. And you could make an argument that as Sarah is pointing her finger at Hagar, she should notice the three pointing back at her. That Sarah's anger at Hagar was really at herself. So I want to look at the text, Jack, to see who started it. But if I'm writing this midrash, I'm going to say Sarah started it by not having any room in her heart for Hagar. For the thing that she did for Sarah and her family. But I want to look at the text to see the order of events. But that is what this text is suggesting, is that Sarah's anger was present, foretelling in ways that Rachel did not have anger. Rachel did not have anger towards the handmaidens. Go ahead, Jeff.
well, I see that Sarah, when she looked out the window and saw the two boys were playing with each other. The playing was kind of odd. It was after that she wanted Hagar and Ishmael to be banned from the family.
Uh-huh.
So, I mean, that I think had a lot to do with that action that she took.
That is not allowed. That's not an excuse.
I don't know about that.
We'll come back to it next Tuesday.
But
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.